Ever get that feeling that the world's collectively just holding its breath over something,
Mm.
like a shadow of fear stretches across, public consciousness.
Yeah.
Sometimes, even when the actual hard evidence of danger feels a little thin on the ground.
Oh, absolutely. That shared sense of unease, that feeling that society is fixated on some looming threat, it's a really powerful experience. And
Yeah,
when you start to look closely at those moments, you often find this, well, this fascinating disconnect between the level of alarm and the actual risk involved.
exactly. And that's really what we're diving into today, this concept of a moral panic. Because it's more than just a fleeting worry, isn't it? It seems to be a deeper social dynamic at play.
Precisely. The term itself, moral panic, it was coined by the sociologist Stanley Cohen. You might know his book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics, from way back in '72.
Right, classic study.
Yeah, and he defined it as basically a widespread, disproportionate public fear, a fear that some specific group or maybe a behavior or even just a condition poses a threat to society's moral fabric or its safety.
And the key word there is disproportionate.
That's the crucial element. The reaction is exaggerated, amplified, compared to whatever the objective danger actually is.
Okay, so today our mission is to really unpack this,
Hmm.
understand what makes a moral panic, well, kick. We'll explore the key characteristics and then really get into a compelling historical example to see how it all unfolds.
Sounds good. So where does this kind of societal episode usually begin?
Well, according to Cohen, one of the first signs is concern.
Concern.
Yeah, that palpable surge of public worry, that feeling that something is fundamentally wrong and needs, immediate attention. Think about periods where there's heightened anxiety around, say, youth behavior, or maybe the emergence of a new social trends people don't understand.
Right, that feeling of, we need to do something about this and fast, even if people aren't entirely sure what this really is.
Exactly.
And that concern, it often seems to latch onto a specific group, doesn't it? Which brings us to the second feature, hostility.
Yes, hostility. Cohen famously called these targeted groups folk devils.
Look, devils. They become the focus of the anxiety. Stereotyped as dangerous, maybe morally inferior, outsiders who are responsible for whatever the perceived problem is.
They become the scapegoats.
Pretty much, yeah. The embodiment of what society feels at that moment. And following that, you often see consensus start to build.
Okay, consensus. But this isn't like everyone sat down and read the research, right?
No. Not necessarily a deeply informed agreement.
Mm-hmm.
It's more a broad sense shared among the media, the public, maybe even figures of authority, that the threat is real and action is required. There's this collective call to address the issue, even if the understanding of it is, well, pretty superficial.
And this feels like where things can really escalate, because the fourth element you mentioned is disproportionality.
Ah, yes. This is key. The reaction, you see it in the media coverage, the public outcry, the solutions being proposed, it's often massively out of step with the actual evidence of the threat.
It's like a small ripple somehow turns into this huge tidal wave of concern.
Exactly that. The response just far exceeds what any kind of rational assessment of the danger would suggest.
Hmm.
And finally, Cohen pointed to volatility. These moral panics, they tend to erupt quite suddenly.
Right.
And then often just as quickly, they can fade away. Though it's important to add the consequences, the fallout, that can linger for a long, long time.
Okay, so we have this kind of recipe.
Mm.
Concern, hostility towards folk devils,
Yeah.
a general agreement something's wrong, a disproportionate reaction, and this tendency to flare up and die down.
That's the framework.
So to really see this in action, let's talk about Cohen's original study, The Mods and Rockers in 1960s Britain.
Right. What's so insightful about Cohen's work here is how he analyzed what were, essentially relatively minor clashes. You had these two youth subcultures.
The mods with their scooters and sharp suits.
Uh-huh. And the rockers, more leather jackets, motorcycles.
Yeah.
And they had some scuffles at British seaside towns like Brighton and Clacton over a couple of bank holiday weekends.
Right. We're talking some fist fights, maybe some deck chairs thrown around, a bit of vandalism. Unfortunate, yes, but hardly the collapse of Western civilization.
Exactly. But the media narrative at the time, it completely amplified these incidents. They were portrayed as these huge, violent confrontations, a sign that society was breaking down, that youth were out of control.
So the media really jumped on it.
Oh, absolutely. They played a crucial role in constructing the mods and rockers as these folk devils. They created these exaggerated, often quite menacing images of them as unruly hordes descending on peaceful towns.
Which then feeds the public fear.
Precisely. It fueled public anxiety, moral condemnation. And the result, you saw increased police presence, calls for tougher laws, harsher sentences, a really significant reaction to what were fundamentally localized disturbances.
It's such a powerful illustration of how a, well, relatively contained issue can be totally blown up into a national preoccupation through this lens of moral panic.
It is.
And this isn't just some dusty old history lesson, is it? I mean, we see similar patterns playing out today, surely.
Absolutely. If you think about how society sometimes responds to various perceived threats, you can definitely see echoes of this framework.
Like what?
Well, consider the long-running debates around video games and violence,
Ah, yeah.
where anxieties about youth behavior have often led to blaming video games, sometimes quite intensely, despite, pretty limited causal evidence linking them directly to real-world violence like school shootings.
Or I guess the example we're going to dive into later, the satanic panic in the U.S.
That's a huge one, yes. A prime example.
We've also seen panics bubble up around certain online trends, haven't we? Like those dangerous-sounding internet challenges that crop up.
Right, the Momo challenge or Blue Whale.
Yeah, often based on very little verified information, maybe just rumors, but sparking widespread fear among parents.
And you could argue that in some contexts, discussions around immigration can take on characteristics of a moral panic.
Else.
Well, when immigrants are broadly scapegoated for complex societal problems like unemployment or crime rates, often despite data that doesn't support that narrative, it taps into that us versus them dynamic.
These examples really highlight the ongoing relevance of Cohen's ideas for understanding how we collectively react to things that scare us.
They really do.
So what's actually going on underneath? Why do these moral panics take hold in society? Is there some kind of, I don't know, social function they fulfill?
That's a really critical question. Sociologists, including Cohen and others who followed him, suggest that moral panics often arise during periods of significant social change or uncertainty.
Okay, when things feel unstable.
Exactly. And in those times, they can function, perhaps unconsciously, to sort of reaffirm existing social norms and boundaries by identifying and condemning a folk devil.
Society draws a line.
Precisely. It collectively reinforces what's considered acceptable behavior and what's not. It clarifies the boundaries of the group.
It's like saying, this is us, the good, normal people, and that threatening other is not us.
That's a good way to put it. It helps solidify a sense of shared identity and values by contrasting it sharply with the perceived threat.
But there's a darker side to that, too.
Well, yes. Unfortunately, moral panics can also be exploited, sometimes quite deliberately, to justify increased social control.
Like what?
Stricter policing, new laws, sometimes even censorship, they can provide a rationale for clamping down.
And we've touched on it a couple of times already, but it feels like the role of the media is just absolutely pivotal in how these things ignite and spread.
Oh, undoubtedly. The media often acts as a powerful amplifier in these situations.
How does that work?
Through, selective reporting, focusing on the most dramatic cases, maybe through sensationalized headlines, creating vivid, often negative stereotypes.
That build the narrative.
They absolutely shape the narrative. They can magnify isolated incidents, make them seem like widespread crises. They play a key role in constructing that image of the folk devil and then fueling public outrage.
It sounds like a feedback loop. A small event happens. The media amplifies it.
Right.
Leads to more public concern, which then drives even more intense media coverage.
Exactly. It's a cycle. This process is often called deviancy amplification.
Deviancy amplification?
Yeah, the idea that the societal reaction to a perceived deviance can actually escalate the perception of that deviance, maybe even inadvertently encourage more of it, or at least make it seem far more common than it is.
Okay, so we have the theory, the framework, the role of the media. Let's really dig into a powerful and frankly disturbing example, the satanic panic, the one that swept through the United States in the 1980s and early 1990s.
Right.
It seems like just a textbook case of a moral panic in action.
It really is a stark, chilling illustration of how widespread fear, fueled almost entirely by unsubstantiated claims, can grip a society and lead to very real, very damaging consequences.
So what was the core fear?
During this time, this pervasive belief emerged, and it spread rapidly, that secret satanic cults were engaged in widespread ritualistic abuse of children. Often the alleged location was daycare centers, but sometimes private homes too.
And the claims were horrific.
Unbelievably so. They involved allegations of sexual abuse, animal sacrifice, even human sacrifice, systematic brainwashing, just terrifying narrative.
And it feels crucial to emphasize this up front. Despite years and years of investigations, police work, trials, no credible evidence ever actually emerged to support these claims of organized satanic ritual abuse, did it?
That is absolutely correct, and it cannot be stressed enough. Law enforcement agencies across the country, including the FBI, conducted extensive investigations. They looked hard, and not a single piece of verifiable physical evidence of these supposed widespread satanic cults or their alleged ritualistic activities was ever found.
Zero evidence.
Zero credible evidence of the organized cult activity that was being claimed, yet the belief persisted and it spread like wildfire.
So how did it start? What were the sparks that ignited this inferno of fear?
Well, one significant catalyst often pointed to is the 1980 book Michelle Remembers.
Ah, yes. I've heard of that.
It was presented as a nonfiction memoir, co-written by Michelle Smith and her psychiatrist, Lawrence Pastor. It detailed her supposed recovered memories of horrific satanic ritual abuse she endured as a child.
Recovered memories. That's a whole other can of worms.
Indeed. And although the book was later widely discredited by journalists and investigators, finding major inconsistencies and lack of corroboration,
At the time, it was huge.
incredibly popular and massively influential, it basically introduced this terrifying narrative template: hidden satanic networks operating secretly within ordinary communities, abusing children in rituals. And that narrative just resonated deeply with certain anxieties simmering in society at the time.
And then the media presumably picked up this narrative and ran with it.
Undeniably, sensationalized media coverage just exploded. You had daytime talk shows dedicating episodes to it, TV news specials, magazines.
Geraldo Rivera's special comes to mind.
That was a very prominent example, yes. It reached millions. Even law enforcement training materials started popping up, focusing on supposed satanic symbols and indicators of ritual abuse, often based on very questionable sources, folklore, and amplifying these unsubstantiated claims.
So it wasn't just supermarket tabloids, it was getting into official channels, too.
It permeated many levels of society, yes.
Can you give us a really concrete example of how this played out, a specific case?
I think the McMartin preschool trial in California is probably the most infamous and chilling example. It started around 1983 and dragged on until 1990.
7 years.
7 years. It became one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in U.S. history, and it centered on the most outlandish, disturbing accusations imaginable against the daycare teachers and staff members of the McMartin family.
What kind of accusations are we actually talking about here? It's hard to even fathom.
Well, the allegations, primarily drawn from interviews with the children, included claims of elaborate secret underground tunnels supposedly built beneath the preschool.
Underground tunnels.
Yes, children being forced to participate in bizarre and terrifying rituals, claims of animal sacrifice, drinking blood, being photographed in abusive situations, even fantastical stories about flying witches and secret rooms appearing and disappearing. Just truly bizarre stuff.
How did these stories even emerge from young children?
Tragically, it became clear that many of the children were subjected to highly suggestive and coercive questioning techniques by therapists and investigators. They were asked leading questions, sometimes repeatedly, often in intimidating settings, which essentially implanted or distorted memories, leading them to recount these unbelievable scenarios that likely never happened.
That's just devastating. The impact on those children, let alone the accused.
Absolutely.
So after this marathon trial, years of investigation, was any of this ever substantiated in court? Any tunnels found? Any proof?
No. Despite exhaustive investigation, digging up the schoolyard, intense scrutiny, not a single piece of credible physical evidence was ever presented to support any of these horrific claims. Eventually, after years and millions of dollars spent, all charges against the remaining defendants were dropped.
But the damage was done.
Irreparably. The lives and reputations of the accused teachers and their families were completely destroyed. The McMartin family lost everything.
And you mentioned earlier, this wasn't just an isolated, bizarre case in California, right? This spread?
Sadly, no. The McMartin case acted almost like a blueprint. Similar accusations started surfacing in communities all across North America, Washington State, Texas, New Jersey, Canada.
A witch hunt effect.
It really had that quality. Dozens of innocent individuals, daycare workers, parents, teachers faced investigation, prosecution, and sometimes imprisonment based entirely on these kinds of unsubstantiated claims, often arising from similar flawed child interviews.
What were the common threads in these cases?
You often saw these highly suggestive interviews with children, a palpable sense of mass hysteria gripping parents and some professionals in the community, and crucially, the widespread use of what was then called recovered memory therapy.
Which is now largely discredited, right?
Yes, it's now considered highly problematic and potentially harmful, unethical in many of the ways it was practiced then, because of its potential to create false memories rather than recover real ones.
Okay, so let's go back to Stanley Cohen's 5 features of a moral panic. How does the satanic panic map onto that framework? It seems to fit perfectly.
It really does. Let's tick them off. First, concern. There was clearly widespread public alarm about child abuse, amplified by this new, terrifying perceived threat of Satanism. Huge concern.
Definitely. Second, hostility. Daycare workers, who are often women entering the workforce in greater numbers, became the primary folk devils. They faced intense public suspicion, fear, and outright condemnation.
Absolutely. Third, consensus. A broad, though often ill-informed consensus developed across significant parts of the media, among many parents, politicians, even segments of law enforcement and therapy communities, that this satanic ritual abuse was a genuine, widespread threat.
Even without the evidence.
Even without the evidence. Fourth, disproportionality. This is maybe the most obvious one. The claims themselves, babies being sacrificed in preschool, secret tunnels, flying witches, were wildly unbelievable, completely disproportionate to any rational assessment of reality.
Just off the charts.
Completely. And finally, volatility. While the peak intensity of the panic, the constant media coverage, eventually subsided in the mid-90s.
It did fade eventually.
It did, but the devastating consequences, the wrongful convictions, the ruined lives that demonstrated its lasting impact, even as the panic itself cooled down. So yes, it hit all 5 points, quite dramatically.
What do you think were some of the underlying societal factors? Why was the U.S. in the 80s and early 90s so susceptible to this kind of panic?
That's complex, but several converging factors likely played a role. As we touched on, the 1980s saw significant shifts in American family structures.
More women working outside the home.
Exactly. More women entering the workforce and a corresponding, quite rapid increase in the use of formal daycare centers. This was a major social change.
And that caused anxiety.
It seems likely it generated some underlying anxieties for some people, anxieties about child safety, about strangers caring for children, perhaps anxieties about these changing family roles themselves. Daycares were a new frontier for many families.
Okay, so anxiety about changing family structures. What else?
Well, there were also broader cultural anxieties floating around, concerns about the occult, fueled by some movies and books, debates over the influence of heavy metal music and Dungeons and Dragons.
Satanic panic elements that predated the daycare scares.
Precisely. And a general sense in some parts of society of moral decline or a loss of traditional values. This panic tapped into those existing fears.
And the media's incentives.
You can't discount that. Sensational stories about hidden dangers, sell newspapers, boost TV ratings. There was undoubtedly a media incentive to amplify the fear, regardless of the factual basis. Fear gets attention.
So what were the ultimate long-term repercussions of this whole period?
The consequences were profound and, in many cases, utterly tragic.
Obviously, the wrongful convictions.
Yes, numerous innocent people were wrongly accused, prosecuted, and imprisoned. Lives shattered, years lost, families torn apart.
And the cost?
The financial cost was enormous. Taxpayers footed the bill for these incredibly long, complex investigations and trials, running into many millions of dollars.
Were there any positive outcomes? Any lessons learned?
Well, if you can call them positive outcomes from such a disaster, the satanic panic did eventually lead to some important changes. Law enforcement agencies became much more aware of the dangers of suggestive interviewing techniques with children.
So better protocols for interviewing kids.
Yes, there's now a much greater emphasis on using non-leading questions, creating supportive environments, and understanding child development in forensic interviews.
And the recovered memory therapy.
That came under intense scrutiny. The panic contributed significantly to a growing skepticism within the psychological and legal communities about the validity and ethical use of therapies that claim to recover repressed memories, especially of trauma alleged to have occurred in early childhood.
So, summing it up, the satanic panic really stands as this powerful, cautionary example of a moral panic. Because
Because it was fundamentally driven by fear, not by factual evidence. It was dramatically amplified by media sensationalism and the efforts of certain moral entrepreneurs who promoted the narrative.
Right.
It was clearly rooted in deeper societal anxieties about family, social change, and morality. And, crucially, it was ultimately proven to be unfounded in its core claims of widespread organized satanic ritual abuse, but not before causing immense, lasting social harm.
A truly sobering example.
It really is. It serves as a potent cautionary tale about the dangers of letting fear run rampant, the importance of critical thinking, and the absolute necessity of relying on credible evidence, especially when accusations are so inflammatory and have such potential to destroy lives.
So, bringing this all together then, we've explored how a moral panic involves this intense collective anxiety about a perceived threat,
Mm-hmm.
often targeting a specific group as folk devils.
Uh-huh.
There's this widespread sense of urgency, a consensus that something must be done, but the reaction itself is way out of proportion to the actual danger. They tend to be volatile, flaring up, and sometimes fading, but leaving damage behind.
That's a good summary.
And the satanic panic just provides this stark, deeply unsettling illustration of all those dynamics playing out in the real world.
It really does. Which perhaps leads us to a final thought for you listening to consider. Given these elements we've discussed today, the concern, the hostility, the consensus, the disproportionality, the volatility, what contemporary issues out there right now might be displaying some of the characteristics of a moral panic?
Hmm, that's a challenging question.
It is, and what are the potential dangers when we as a society get caught up in that kind of widespread, disproportionate fear? Even when the initial concerns might seem on the surface valid, it's really worth reflecting on the role the media plays and maybe our own societal anxieties in shaping how we perceive threats in the world around us today.